Apple is in a very strange position today. On the one hand, it is one of the richest and most technologically powerful companies in the world, controlling the iPhone, Mac, Apple Watch, AirPods, its own processors, operating systems, and a massive ecosystem of billions of devices. On the other hand, when the real generative AI revolution began in late 2022, Apple was nowhere near the front of the pack. ChatGPT suddenly demonstrated that a computer could actually converse with a human, write code, analyze documents, explain complex topics, work with images, and maintain a long conversation. Google began aggressively developing Gemini. Microsoft integrated Copilot into its products and Azure Cloud. Meta began releasing the Llama family. Amazon started investing enormous amounts of money in AI infrastructure and its partnership with Anthropic. And against this backdrop, Siri looked as if it had become stuck somewhere in the previous decade. This is particularly surprising because Apple itself made Siri mainstream back in 2011. For millions of people, it was their first real voice assistant on a smartphone. You could set a timer, send a message, check the weather, call someone, or create a reminder. But the problem was that the old Siri and modern large language models work in fundamentally different ways. Classic Siri primarily tried to recognize a predefined command. If a person said something the system understood, it performed the action. But if the question became more complicated or the user continued the conversation, Siri often lost the context. ChatGPT demonstrated a completely different approach. A person can speak naturally, change the subject, return to previous messages, ask complex questions, and does not have to adapt every sentence to the computer. That was when it became especially obvious just how far Siri had fallen behind. It is important to understand that Apple did not miss the artificial intelligence revolution altogether. The company had been using machine learning for years in iPhone cameras, Face ID, photo processing, Apple Watch, the keyboard, speech recognition, and countless other features. Apple had even built an extremely important hardware foundation in advance, its own processors, the neural engine, and Apple Silicon, so Apple did not fall behind in machine learning itself. It fell behind specifically in large language models and generative artificial intelligence. And this is where the company's own culture played a role. Apple is accustomed to developing products internally for a very long time, carefully testing them and showing them to the public only when it considers them sufficiently mature. The AI industry works at a much faster pace. OpenAI can release a new model, improve it a few months later, and then add tools, memory, voice, images, and agents. Google does the same. Models are updated constantly. What represents cutting-edge technology today can look outdated a year later, and Apple found it difficult to adapt to that pace. Historically, Apple has often allowed other companies to enter a market first. MP3 players existed before the iPod. Smartphones existed before the iPhone. Tablets existed before the iPad. Smartwatches existed before the Apple Watch. Apple usually arrived later and made the technology more convenient for mainstream users. But AI is different from most of those previous markets. Here, timing matters enormously. The earlier a company begins training models, the faster it accumulates experience. The earlier it builds data centers, the more computing capacity it has several years later. The earlier it attracts the best researchers, the stronger its team becomes. That is why by 2024 to 2025, it had become clear that Apple really was falling behind. In 2024, the company introduced Apple Intelligence. At the presentation, the concept looked extremely powerful. Apple did not want to simply create another chatbot. It wanted to build a personal AI that understood the user's context. For example, Siri was supposed to understand who your mother was, find information about her flight in your messages or email, see events in your calendar, understand what was on the screen, and perform actions inside applications. In theory, this is even more interesting than ordinary ChatGPT, because ChatGPT may know an enormous amount of information about the world, but it does not necessarily know what email your colleague sent you this morning or when your next meeting is. Apple potentially has access to this context directly on the user's device. This is where one of Apple's main advantages lies. The company controls the iPhone. The device contains messages, photos, contacts, calendar entries, notes, email, apps, and an enormous amount of personal information. If Siri is given secure access to this information with the user's permission, it could become much more useful than an ordinary chatbot. But at the same time, this is where one of Apple's biggest problems lies: privacy. Apple has spent many years building its brand around the idea that users' personal data should remain as protected as possible. But the more AI knows about a person, the more useful it becomes. This creates a conflict. To make Siri truly personal, the system needs context, but Apple does not want to simply send all of a user's personal information to a massive cloud data center. That is why the company built the Apple Intelligence architecture around several layers. Some tasks are performed directly on the device. More complex requests are handled through private cloud compute. And in some cases, third-party models can be involved. And here, Apple made a move that would have seemed almost impossible just a few years ago. The company acknowledged that it does not necessarily need to have the best general-purpose language model in the world. Apple initially integrated ChatGPT, and in 2026, it became known that Apple had entered into a multi-year collaboration with Google Gemini for a new AI architecture for Apple and Siri. At first glance, this looks almost like a defeat. Apple's main rival in the mobile operating system world is helping make Siri smarter. But if you look deeper, the strategy may be completely different. Apple may view the large language model as just one component of the overall system. The user does not necessarily need to know which model processed a particular request. An Apple model could run on the device. A more complex task could be sent to private cloud compute. Gemini could be used for some requests. ChatGPT could be used for others. And the user simply says, "Siri." Apple controls the interface, the device, permissions, applications, and personal context. And this is a very important difference between Apple's strategy and OpenAI's strategy. OpenAI wants users to come to ChatGPT. Google wants users to use Gemini. Apple wants people to continue buying iPhones and remain within its ecosystem. Therefore, for Apple, the AI model itself may not be the end product. It may simply be a component. It is similar to the iPhone camera. Apple does not manufacture every single camera component itself, but users perceive the entire result as an Apple product. The same thing could happen with artificial intelligence. And this leads to the main question: why is Apple investing far less money in AI than some of its competitors? Because the scale of spending is indeed dramatically different. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Meta are building enormous data centers and spending tens and hundreds of billions of dollars annually on infrastructure. But it is important to understand that these expenses cannot be compared directly. Google sells Google Cloud, Microsoft sells Azure, Amazon sells AWS. Their data centers serve not only their own models, but also enormous numbers of external customers. Apple does not have a comparable cloud business. It does not need to build infrastructure for thousands of companies. Nevertheless, the gap is still enormous. Apple spends significantly less on capital AI infrastructure than the largest hyperscalers. At the same time, Apple's research and development spending is growing rapidly. During the first 9 months of fiscal 2026, the company's R&D spending reached approximately $34 billion, an increase of roughly 1/3 compared with the previous year. Apple explicitly states that part of this increase is related to investments in artificial intelligence and infrastructure. So saying that the company is saving money on AI altogether would be incorrect. It is investing a great deal. It is simply doing so in a different way. Why does Apple not want to follow the path taken by Google and Microsoft? Perhaps because the company considers the insane infrastructure race too expensive. Why should Apple build its own model capable of answering every question humanity can ask if it can use Gemini for that? Apple can focus on what truly differentiates it from its competitors: privacy, personal context, Apple Silicon, integration with iOS, and on-device models. But this strategy carries a huge risk. Apple cannot remain dependent on Google forever. If artificial intelligence really becomes the new interface to the computer, the company that controls AI will gain enormous power over the user. That is why Apple continues to develop its own foundation models. The company already has on-device models optimized for Apple Silicon, as well as larger models for its server infrastructure. In addition, in August 2026, Reuters reported that Apple had trained a separate large language model for China with support from Alibaba. This is a very important signal. Apple is not simply going to turn Siri into a shell on top of Gemini. The company continues to develop its own technologies. Most likely, the future of Siri will be hybrid. A smaller Apple model will run directly on the iPhone. A more powerful model will operate through private cloud compute. If powerful general-purpose intelligence is needed, Gemini or another model can be used. In China, Apple's own models and Alibaba technologies may be used, and the user will never have to think about all this complexity. They will simply ask a question. That is why Apple Intelligence is better understood not as a single model, but as an entire AI system. In June 2026, Apple introduced the next generation of Siri AI. The company promises much more natural conversations, an understanding of personal context, the ability to work with on-screen content, and the ability to perform actions inside apps. In other words, Siri is gradually transforming from a voice button into a fully fledged system agent. For example, a user could say, "Find the email with my flight information, check when I arrive, and tell the person I am meeting if I am going to be late." To execute such a command, the AI must access information from multiple sources, understand the context, and perform a sequence of actions. This is precisely the next major stage of AI, not simply answering questions but actually completing tasks. And this is where Apple could suddenly gain a serious advantage. OpenAI may create a more intelligent model, but OpenAI does not have its own mobile operating system. Anthropic does not have the iPhone. Microsoft no longer has a major mobile platform. Apple, meanwhile, already controls the device on which users spend most of their day. Siri is on the iPhone. It can also work across the Mac, Apple Watch, AirPods, and other devices. If Apple can make it genuinely intelligent, it does not need to convince users to install a new service. The AI is already inside the system. This distribution is one of Apple's biggest advantages. The company has an installed base of several billion devices. Even if Siri is slightly less capable than the best version of ChatGPT, it could still be more convenient for an enormous number of everyday tasks. For example, people do not need the smartest AI in the world to reschedule a meeting, find a photo, or send a message. They need an AI that understands their personal context. And this is where Apple could be extremely strong. But it is still too early to talk about victory. The company has already promised new personalized Siri features once before and was forced to delay them. Therefore, in 2026, Apple first needs to prove that the new Siri actually works, not on a presentation stage, but for millions of real users. Because a system-level AI agent is far more complicated than an ordinary chatbot. If ChatGPT makes a mistake in an answer, that is unpleasant. If Siri makes a mistake and sends the wrong file to the wrong person, that is already a serious problem. Apple is therefore forced to solve not only the question of intelligence, but also the question of reliability. Siri must understand when an action can be performed automatically and when it needs to ask for confirmation. It must work correctly with permissions. It must not confuse people, documents, meetings, and applications. This is precisely why Apple may move more cautiously than OpenAI, but it cannot justify itself with caution for too long. Competitors are constantly accelerating. Google Gemini is becoming increasingly integrated into Android. OpenAI is creating agents. Anthropic is actively developing computer use and tool integration. If Apple takes 2 years to develop a feature that competitors release within a few months, the gap may continue to grow. That is why the next 2 or 3 years will be critical. If Apple finally releases a truly functional AI-powered Siri, its position could change very quickly. Not because Siri will suddenly become smarter than every model in the world, but because it will gain access to something most competitors do not have: deep, system-level context. Imagine a Siri that understands what you are seeing on the screen, knows your conversations, and can work with your calendar, files, and applications. This is why Apple may try to win not the model race, but the race to build personal agents. These are two different competitions. In the first, OpenAI and Google currently look much stronger. In the second, Apple can still become one of the leaders. It has another important advantage: its own processors. Apple has been developing the neural engine for many years. With each new generation of iPhone, more and more AI tasks can be performed locally. This matters not only for privacy, but also for economics. Cloud-based AI costs money with every request. If some of the computation is performed directly on the iPhone processor, Apple can save enormous amounts of money on servers. The company can therefore gradually move more and more AI functions onto the device. In a few years, an iPhone could be capable of performing locally tasks that today require a server. And then Apple's strategy could turn out to be much smarter than it currently appears. Instead of building data centers costing hundreds of billions of dollars, the company is effectively distributing computing power across hundreds of millions of devices. Of course, the iPhone will not replace a massive AI cluster for training models, but for personal inference, this is an extremely powerful model. There is another reason why Apple should not be written off. The company has enormous financial resources. If management eventually decides that dependence on Gemini has become too dangerous, Apple can dramatically increase its investments. It can build its own data centers, acquire an AI company, recruit top researchers, invest tens of billions of dollars in its own models, and create specialized server chips. Apple has already done something similar with processors. When dependence on Intel began limiting the development of its products, the company spent several years developing Apple Silicon and ultimately completely transformed the architecture of the Mac. It is entirely possible that a similar story will unfold with AI. Today, Gemini is helping Apple catch up with the market more quickly, but in a few years, the company will almost certainly want to control a much larger portion of the AI stack itself. That is why Gemini can be viewed more as a bridge than as a final solution. Apple is buying itself time. That time is necessary to develop its own models, infrastructure, and tools. But time is not infinite. Google is not standing still. OpenAI is developing as well. Therefore, Apple needs to move faster than it is accustomed to. The question of who will control the personal AI of the future is becoming especially important. Today, the operating system is the primary intermediary between humans and computers. But in a few years, that role could be taken over by AI. Instead of opening an app, a person will simply say what they want. The AI will choose the appropriate application and perform the task itself. For example, instead of opening Uber, a person could say, "Book me a car so that I arrive 10 minutes before my meeting." Instead of opening Booking, they could say, "Find a hotel near the conference within roughly the price range I usually choose." Instead of opening Calendar, they could say, "Move all non-critical meetings to after 3 o'clock because my flight has been delayed." If this becomes the standard interface, the role of AI becomes enormous. And this is precisely why Apple cannot allow ChatGPT to become the primary interface of the iPhone. Imagine that a user does everything through ChatGPT. ChatGPT knows their context, applications, habits, and history. Gradually, it becomes less important whether the person is using an iPhone or Android. The main platform is no longer iOS. It becomes AI. For Apple, this represents a potentially existential risk. That is why the company will fight extremely seriously for Siri, not because it wants to win a competition between voice assistants, but because it is trying to maintain control over the interface of the future. And here, Tim Cook's attitude toward AI is particularly interesting. Cook has never said that artificial intelligence is a scam. On the contrary, Apple's leadership has repeatedly emphasized that AI is a fundamental technology. But Apple's approach differs from that of its competitors. The company does not want to make AI a separate product that the user constantly has to notice. It wants intelligence to disappear into the iPhone itself. People do not need to know which model is running. The device simply needs to become smarter. This is a very characteristic Apple approach. The company rarely sells technology for the sake of technology. It sells the end-user experience. And if Siri can genuinely control applications, understand what is on the screen, and use personal context, Apple will not advertise the number of parameters in its model. It will show a person solving with a single sentence a task that previously required opening 5 different applications. For example, Siri, Tell my wife that the plane has landed, find the hotel address from our conversation, and call me a car. If all of this works properly, the user will be almost completely indifferent to which part of the task was processed by an Apple model and which part by Gemini. And this may be the company's biggest opportunity. Apple genuinely missed the first stage of the AI revolution. It did not create ChatGPT, it did not build the best frontier model, and it did not become the leader of the public AI race. Siri has indeed fallen far behind modern chatbots. Apple has even had to postpone some of the features it previously promised. But a different stage is now beginning. AI is gradually transforming from a chatbot into an agent. And this is where the situation becomes much more interesting. Because an agent does not simply need to be intelligent. It needs access to applications, the device, data, the interface, permissions, and personal context. This is precisely what Apple controls better than a huge number of AI companies. Therefore, Apple is far behind when it comes to creating the most powerful general-purpose AI brain, but at the same time, it is extremely close to the user. Therefore, the next few years could become some of the most important in the company's modern history. Apple needs to prove three things. First, that Siri can truly become intelligent and reliable. Second, that the company is capable of developing AI quickly enough. And third, that it will not become permanently dependent on Google. If all of this succeeds, Apple could still become one of the major winners of the AI era, because it does not necessarily need to create the smartest chatbot in the world. It needs to create the best personal assistant for an iPhone owner. And that is a much more realistic goal. But if Apple once again moves too slowly, ChatGPT, Gemini, or another AI could gradually take the place that once belonged to the operating system itself. And then the main question will no longer be how good Siri is. The main question will be who actually controls the user's digital life.